Hello, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alex Ash, and I am the Growth Marketing Manager here at SpyCloud. Today, we'll be talking about current challenges SOC teams face and how action-driven analytics can unlock automated workflows to help your SOC team build the foundation for actionable data to optimize your automation potential. I'm happy to introduce our speakers today, Taylor Kuppick, Senior Product Marketing Manager, and Chip Witt, Senior Vice President of Product Management. And with that, I will hand it off to Taylor for further introductions and to go ahead and get us started.
Hi there, I'm Taylor Koppick, Senior Product Marketing Manager here at SpyCloud, and very excited to talk about this subject matter today, explain a bit more about how we can help you do more with actionable data.
And my name is Chip Witt. I'm Senior VP of Product Management here at SpyCloud, and I'm really excited to join this conversation with Taylor today to add value, add clarity, and insight from some of the conversations that I've had.
So today, we're really going to level set the current state of affairs we see with SOC teams and some of the top challenges we know that are really getting in the way of innovation and driving progress and driving towards automation. But then we want to show the goal state of why all this matters. It really shows some applicable ways you can drive towards making use of this data to actually unlock automation for your teams. And of course, we'll have time for some Q&A at the end.
So we're going to jump in right into the current state of affairs to kind of understand what the landscape is that people are operating in and why this topic of automation is so important. So first we need to talk about how did we get here? As cyber attacks grow in sophistication with evolving tactics, techniques, and procedures and targets, security operations teams are they're playing a very crucial role in safeguarding organizations by protecting employee identities and access to corporate data. But it's a difficult job. Today, the evolved role of SOC team is to combat threats specifically designed to evade detection. So they have to be right all the time, where the bad guy only has to be right once. In this webinar, we're going to take a deeper look at what you're up against so that we can more clearly understand how to tackle modern SOC challenges. The stats that you're actually seeing on the screen here are actually taken from the Times 2023 Voice of the SOC report, and they really tell a really good story here in terms of what SOC teams are dealing with. 63% of practitioners experience some level of burnout. And that's detrimental to the success of the teams because if you're burnt out, you're not doing a very good job at identifying those threats. 50% of respondents say that their SOC team is understaffed, which means that not only are your existing staff burnt out, they don't have enough relief on the bench to solve the big problems that they're having to face. And then finally, more than 80% say their workloads have increased in the past year. And this makes sense from the data that we've seen. And certainly no signs of it stopping anytime soon. So security teams, you're not crazy in feeling like your job is tough. It really is. It's a relentless and sometimes thankless work to safeguard employee digital identities and protect corporate data.
So now we'll talk about a bit more of the other challenges that are really hindering these teams from driving towards automation. The first off really is people. Some of the things really standing in the way of security teams really driving towards production is just understanding the employees and consumers that we're working with every day. The first line of defense of the enterprise network is actually the people behind the computers. And just human behavior often forces these teams to really divert their attention and their focus to try to prevent attacks happening just by what's happening in our daily lives. Even the best data and the best tooling can't really solve everything that humans are doing. A few things we see that are really getting in the way of the frustration for these SOC teams and blocking automation comes down to passwords. In the end, passwords are still one of the primary ways of authentication and login, and teams know their employees still engage in this risky behavior of reusing passwords that might have already been compromised, reusing passwords across devices, across applications, and it's just difficult for SOC teams to really understand what's actually in use and how much threat actually exists there. Also, just some of the knowledge gaps in just the daily lives of employees and the consumers. Inadvertently, people click on malicious links accidentally, or they open up phishing emails or other techniques that, again, provide access for criminals to get access to the actual enterprise network and open door for other malware infections and data breaches and just stolen credentials. And of course, humans still like to prioritize convenience. There's many ways throughout the day that just make it more difficult for security teams to really protect what's happening within their organization. People often sync their work and personal profiles. Now, the remote world is very blended of what actually is home and work and life. And this causes more just frustration and challenges for security teams. It's often very common for people to install new applications and new tools that work well for them. And this shadow IT and shadow data adds more hidden risk for security teams. So all in all, even with the proper data and the information to everything of what's happening across your enterprise, actionable data could help to account for some of these human elements, but you can't replace all the impacts out there, but you can hopefully minimize what this causes for security teams. Now, what else is really causing burnout and overwork and getting in the way of security teams driving towards automation? A few things that we fairly common we see across the teams are, first off, dealing with the expanded security perimeter. Now with the new bring your own device policies and relying on third-party hosted apps and services, there's just so much more significant vulnerabilities introduced into the security environment that is getting in the way of teams actually driving towards automation. The focus is getting into visibility of what's actually happening, much less having the time or the data to know how to write script and test the automation needed to protect their employees and their customers. This also leads to a growing attack surface. There's just so much out there that teams don't know if it's actually secure because visibility is still a challenge. According to a HackerOne report, over 52% of organizations don't know how much of this growing attack surface is actually secured. So there's several paths for these cyber criminals to attempt to steal this confidential data and target your employees and get after your sensitive IP. So SOC teams don't really have the necessary insights, much less the actionable data to even know the full breadth of their attack surface. We're still trying to get this visibility. And also, these security teams are stuck in the middle of using other tools that might have been purchased by different teams, like your IT team, your networking, your identity team. And security teams are stuck in the middle trying to make sense of all of this to drive towards automation. But with so many different consoles and tools to try to investigate incidents, the time is spent trying to dive into the gaps, even know what is out there and how to respond to it. And these tools are only as good as the data being ingested. And a lot of time is spent actually maintaining and piecing these tools together into a seamless workflow instead of actually trying to drive towards automation. And finally, just all the noise that's out there with false alarms and poor data quality coming in, teams are spent just fighting fires and doing tedious tasks and responding to things every day that is getting in the way of building out their automation to protect their employees. And all in all, there's one other main challenge we see out there, and it really comes down to the data.
So in talking about the data, one of the things that we actually need to recognize is there's a tremendous reliance on traditional threat intelligence platforms to feed processes. And as SOC teams evolve, they're trying to automate using this information. But the problem is the signal to noise is not significant enough to actually drive automation. It requires human effort to separate out the noise from the true signal and then provide a means to automate the recovery of that. And that's an important aspect there too, is that information and indications of compromise or indicators of compromise as they come in, they don't provide deep level context. They require an analyst to spend some time asking, hey, is this relevant to us? If so, what do we do now? Data is never refined enough to the point of being actually actionable. And actionability is the cornerstone of operation being able to put it to work in the organization. If it's not refined or dependable, you can't automate, and that's what we're talking about here. The other thing that's also really interesting about threat intel platforms in general and threat intelligence as it comes in through those platforms is that it doesn't provide definitive evidence of compromise. It struggles to provide intelligence that highlights what criminals are actually using today to crack into organizations and do the things that they are doing. And that is a cornerstone to being able to take appropriate action in the environment. So if we talk about the goal state, this is why it's so important to figure out how to effectively implement automation and in what context. What does automation mean? Automation offers a path forward for security leaders to scale, use their limited resources more efficiently, and therefore allow SOC teams to spend time on other things that are more meaningful and fulfilling tasks. And this is a great quote, again, from the Times 2023 Voice of the SOC report, is automate the present tedium and security teams can anticipate the threats of tomorrow. That's the intelligence of letting your systems automate things and do the things that they can do well and freeing up that human intelligence to do the things that it does well. And that's what we all hope for as we move towards a brighter tomorrow. I used to spend a lot of time talking about information science, and one of the cornerstones of that is the transition of raw data into information. So if you actually look at data, bits of information floating about, if you think about all of that coming in all in one place, it's not very useful. In order for it to become information, you have to organize that data. And then further, to make that information knowledge, you have to add additional context, additional analysis on top of it to then inform action. And actionability is what we're talking about when we actually are talking about automation. One of the contexts that I think is important to bring up in this particular vein is that when we talk about automation, we don't always mean automation all the way through to remediation. I had the honor of talking to a bunch of security leaders recently, and one of them was talking about SOAR as a technology use in most SOCs. And of course, SOAR stands for Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response. And one of the things that he brought to light is that oftentimes the SO part of that equation is more important than the A and R. And what he meant was that automation is not just about remediating, sometimes it's about enriching data so that the analyst can make better decisions. And again, that requires analysis. It requires actually going all the way through this tree to bring forth knowledge that can drive forward better action, whether that's a machine taking that action and automating that remediation, or whether it's automating the enrichment process to inform that human so that they're making better decisions. Really good example of where you wouldn't want to automate would be you see something that indicates a compromise on the CFO presenting something to the board. You wouldn't want a machine making the decision to interrupt that and invalidate credentials or impact that presentation in any way. So you have to have some intelligence built into how, where, and in what capacity you automate. So when we talk about effective automation, 93% of SOC time respondents believed that automation would improve their work-life balance. And this is important, right? Effective automation prevents and protects both proactively and reactively. It maximizes the time that the SOC is spending on things that are important and keeping their productivity up. And also, by virtue of having process-driven response, it improves the reliability. Also allows SOC teams to focus on other tasks such as research, development, and integrations, looking around the corner at the threats of tomorrow, finding new opportunities for the organization to grow and become even more secure. And then, of course, the final piece here, effective automation really lends to happier, less burnout SOC teams, which, as we started earlier, that is a big cornerstone of the problems in a lot of organizations. And the idea there is if you have staff that are happier and less burnt out, you're going to retain them for longer and put them to good work to protect the organization in a more proactive way over a longer period of time.
So we have some good news. There is a way forward. We're going to show you now how you can actually drive towards some of this smart automation using the right data. So we see three main pillars of the steps you can take towards driving towards automation. You might be in a good spot right now. We're going to provide a checklist after this talk to help you kind of see where you are right now, perhaps some gaps you can fill and where you want to go next. But it's really important to focus on the data that you have access to, the type of data, and then how to actually layer that into your workflows. So the first pillar we're going to cover is, again, the source of your data. Where is this coming from? But more importantly, what is the speed at which you're getting it? After that, it comes down to the different attributes of how you define actionable data. How the data is presented to you and all the information you have within each record is very important to really build the trust, knowing you can actually spend time building automated workflows to protect your employees and your business. After that, it comes down to layering this actionable data into the tools that you're already using across your teams with these seamless integrations. So we'll talk to these three main pillars to show where you are as you drive towards automation.
Fundamental question you may be asking yourself is, would you automate workflows based on old data? Probably not, because it's only the current relevant data that's in criminals' hands that's actively being used that is truly actionable. And so when we talk about the dark web or the deep and dark net or however you refer to it, a lot of times people think of it in terms of a unidimensional monolith of information that's out there inaccessible to the normal novice and that criminals are, accessing and leveraging openly and trading. And that's not exactly true. It is true, but it's more complex than just a monolith. In fact, we talked about the problem of threat intelligence platforms earlier. Most of those platforms leverage a lot of open forum data that if you look at um, the dark web as a gumball, multi-layered. The top level, the surface layer, is where you're going to find a lot of commodity data that's publicly traded in paste bin sites and other sorts of places that can be easily scraped. That's the bulk of tip information that is coming to organizations, and it's very noisy. That's a huge problem. You can't automate based on that. Then you have some inner layers that become a little bit more interesting in terms of value. You have less common data sets available in the middle vetted forums, and these are forums that require access, but are a little bit harder to get to in some contexts, but are not necessarily closed off. They're not truly, truly deep and dark in the context that people like to think they are. The data is valuable enough to sell. It's high volume collections of automated information it's complex information, but it's possible to actually leverage that information and collect it and use it in various ways. Collection requires knowledge of underground markets, but beyond that, it's fairly easily accessible. And it fits in also into a commodity level of information that's being shared. And you get into the lower and core levels of the deep and dark web, you get into high value data and stuff that's harder to get access to without people that have tradecraft or have the secret handshake, get invites to access that information. And this becomes really interesting information from the standpoint of targeted threats, other sorts of things that you are really caring about in terms of protecting your organization, because it's data on breaches, information that is tied to individual relationships and the context of that information. Accessing it requires relationships and reputation to get access to that information. So databases are often unique and of very high value at that lower level. And then in the core level, that's the stuff that's super scary. It's dangerous communities that are sharing extremely sensitive data. And it requires long-standing and intimate relationships, and operational security becomes a really big thing there. So again, tradecraft and getting access. And the reason why I like to surface these areas is that it's hard to find organizations that provide security solutions and data at those lower two levels. And so when you're looking for data to automate, you want to be using the highest fidelity data that's actually part of what criminals are actively buying, trading, selling, and using in criminal enterprise. Because if you don't have that information, again, it's noisy and it's not very useful.
So hopefully you're nodding your head. This is making sense. But again, that's just the source of the data. Regardless of where you get it from, data is still data. In order to actually drive these decisions and drive towards automation, you want to make sure that it's giving you direction and matter and focus on more your business and what you need to do. So some of the foundations that we see are key for defining this actionable data that really helps you build this automation comes down to a few things. The first one is all about curation. Is this data actually curated to remove all the noise, prevent alerts, and make sure you're responding to alerts that matter to your business? Data by itself is just data. You need access to this information that is machine readable to actually be ingested into your tools. Has it been parsed? Has it been normalized? Have you validate all these billions of data points that could mean something valuable for your business or not? A lot of companies take pride in all the data they publish. There's so much happening, so much noise out there that could matter to your business, but a lot of it could just be noise. What we see often is just these duplicate data that most tips are providing, because some of the information being published is just duplicates that's been repackaged to the combo list that it was already exposed in previous breaches. This doesn't really matter for driving towards automation because you would have taken action on it the first time. So it's important to make sure that this curation discards information that has already been duplicated in combo lists, but also we know that within the records, there's so many attributes that could be of value. You might want to look for information that's already been discarded that does not contain high value PII that relates to your employees or consumers, but also you might want to discard records that don't contain passwords that you couldn't actually drive action on. So that's curation. The next one is all about having information that really has been enriched to provide insights on where to take action. Great. So if you've removed the duplicates, you make sure it's including high value PII and passwords. What's next? It really comes down to the enrichment for both breach records and information gleaned from malware records. On the breach side, you want to make sure that information you actually ingest and start analyzing really includes all the contextual information you need to help drive your decisions for it to automate. You need things like the breach source, the description, and of course the password itself. The more you have about the event will help you decide what you should be automating and what decisions need to be made by your team, both in terms of triaging and priority. Now, on the malware side, it's very important to, again, to get as much context as possible. Everything, not just about the device, but anything that helps you understand the severity and the priority and what the actual full exposure might be to bring risks to your business. You need to understand the date and time of the infection, the IP address, the infection path, any of the target URLs that were included with the malware records, but of course, as much credentials and cookies and passwords that might have been exposed as well. This is very important to know how to stop malware infections from turning to full-blown ransomware events. Now, for both breach records and for malware logs, passwords are key, but on the enrichment, look for a source that actually that is providing these plain text passwords. You don't want to spend the time actually trying to crack the information yourself to understand what to do with it. To really drive action, really be productive, is to have access to the plain text passwords from the get-go so that you can actually move forward with some quick scans to actually see the severity of what's actually exposed in the hands of active employees. The final one is all about correlation. You want to make sure that the data are being correlated to help you understand the full scope of exposures. We see often that if there's been exposed an email once, it probably appears across multiple breach records in our data set. You want to make sure you can look for the full picture of exposed employee identities to know how many credentials are out there across all the different breaches and malware records so that, again, you can prioritize correctly, triage it, and set up the rules in place for automating appropriately to the extent of the risk to your business and your employees. Now, those are a few of the foundations. There's a few more that Chip's going to let you know about.
So one of the things that's kind of interesting in this story is that you also need to have data that adapts to circumstance. What do we mean by this? Criminals change tactics. As defenses become better in one area, criminals will leverage the next lowest hanging fruit to do their bad stuff. So when you start thinking about what criminals are leveraging to gain access to identities and corporate data, a lot of it is hinged on credentials, right? Usernames, passwords, things that are easily stolen by virtue of hacking a site and stealing a database of users associated with that, and knowing that password reuse is so high, executing on that, leveraging that in a meaningful way to compromise enterprises. But the tactics change as the landscape for passwords has changed, and the world has changed quite a bit. Even in the last 7 years, it's changed significantly. Now we're actually looking at a world where criminals are leveraging things like cookies or API keys, other, more esoteric things that are still tied to identity, but are not tied to identity in the same way that we're used to. So you need to have data that adapts to evolving criminal tactics. And this is incredibly important. This deep understanding of the criminal ecosystem means you're able to stay ahead of evolving threats before they become mainstream, knowing what the criminals are actively doing so that you can stand in front of that and block with insights into stolen session cookies or API keys or password vaults or whatever the next thing is. Finally, does your data prevent exposures across your supply chain and your VIPs, your executives, your key staff developers, and other sorts of folks? This is important for automation because it gives insight into third parties for automating their own solutions. You can inform policies for your partners because, as we've seen in several major newsworthy cases that are still unraveling, the supply chain is a significant source for criminals to leverage to gain access to your enterprise because we're trusting these third parties with access to various things. And if their security situation is not such that they're addressing threats, that then cascades into your risk. And that's incredibly important to be able to shore that up, or at least have visibility into it, to have the conversation about how you tier access to data and applications by virtue of those risk factors. And I think that kind of segues nicely into automated workflows, in terms of, now you have the foundations in place for actionable data. What's next?
Exactly, that's right. So you have the right data source. Now it's about actually layering this into your workflows with some seamless integrations to actually see the output of this automation and really drive towards productivity. So a few of the actual workflows that we can really see to help your security teams make more, go across a few different tools you're running across your system. On the directory services side, it all comes down to your identity. Regardless of how you're managing your services on-prem, hybrid, or in the cloud, having access to this fresh, actionable data helps you actually prevent against next-gen threats and keep your employees and consumers safe. Now, on the actionable data side, we mentioned the need for having this enrichment and these plain text passwords available, published as soon as you get them, because it's very important for you to start setting up these automated scans to check how many credentials are actively exposed that are being used by your active employees. This isn't possible if you don't have access to plain text passwords. And following this practice will help you actually align with some of the latest NIST password guidelines, where most vendors that you're running will let you actually integrate this data into to run scans daily to see how much risk exists out there. You want to make sure you're using your time to understand the priority of where you should focus your team's effort, not spending manually time seeing how much risk exists with your customers by looking at the passwords. Now, with the right data, you can actually scan to see the threat of what's actually exposed that could be in the hands of the criminals that your employees are using, perhaps across multiple systems. But not just scanning to see what's out there, you also want to make sure you're automating the workflows, what happens next. We recommend actually setting up some workflows to go ahead and automatically force a password reset if a match was found. The power comes down to you setting the actual remediation path, but having access to the right data helps you know you can make the decision that if you do see your employees are running something that is compromised or potentially matching something else out there, you want to make sure you can configure the notifications of letting your employee know they should reset their password, or go ahead and making the change yourself. This helps you really prevent any potential gaps from criminals having access to your credentials. And it all comes down to what's possible with this actionable data that you can ingest in your systems.
To add to that, the Simmons source story is a very strong one as well, as oftentimes in organizations, you're already managing log entries, events from all sorts of disparate systems in a consolidated place for your SOC to manage. Are you bringing in data related to credential theft, cookie hijacks, any of the information that we've been talking about in terms of some of the data, dynamic or otherwise, to help inform decisions around other events that are happening in your organization? That is incredibly important, not only to identify events as incidents themselves, but to provide enrichment on things that you're seeing so that you can kind of draw correlation between multiple disparate events that by themselves may not look like anything, but combined together can help you automatically draw those correlations and lead towards an orchestration or an actual remediation event. And that's incredibly important. Part of that too is SOARs play an incredible role, as we were talking about earlier, automatically creating playbooks within your SOAR so that you can actually have that workflow either enrich and enhance an analyst's capabilities or drive it all the way through to remediation, because it isn't just in the directory services themselves that you might want to remediate. You might want to correlate that with other information and drive that action through systems that are looking at a broader context. So bringing it back to the business value here, again, automation offers a path forward for security leaders to scale, use their limited resources more efficiently, and therefore allow their SOC teams to spend time on other more meaningful and fulfilling tasks. That is incredibly important. So take a breath, measure, optimize your automation, and keep improving over time. It isn't a one and done situation. It's a continuous process. Life's a journey, not a destination. And in security context, that actually truly applies. It isn't about getting to a particular destination. We want to be more secure for sure, but it really is about the journey and continuing to improve, leveraging the information data that you have at your disposal to make intelligent decisions and make your team more efficient. So we can't say all of that without saying this. SpyCloud exists to prevent criminals from benefiting off of the information that they steal. And so we do have a checklist that will be published soon that will help you answer some questions around selecting the right vendor, which we, of course, are biased and think is us. We can certainly help you with your automation. SpyCloud Enterprise Protection safeguards employees' digital identities, delivering a solution that continuously monitors for compromised credentials, keeps corporate data safe, and reduces overall enterprise risk. With actionable analysis, security teams can extend automated protection across their organization while optimizing response and remediation efforts for proactive coverage against targeted attacks. And that's an incredible important part of rapid response through seamless automation.
Right. The Q&A portion of today's presentation. We have a couple of questions here. Let me just get to them. All right, one of our questions. Automation sounds great, but it is probably naive to think that it is the answer for everything. What can you say about the drawbacks, or maybe more specifically, the aspects of automation that one should look out for as part of this journey? Chip, I'm going to throw that to you.
Yeah, there's a lot of meat on that particular bone. I think some of the stuff related to this is stuff that we talked about in this presentation, is that you have to have data that you rely on or can rely on that is of high fidelity and is coming from the right places that are really identifying criminal activity, in the sense that criminals are actively using, trading, and leveraging the information. Because if you're not taking action on that information, it's not pretty useful. But beyond that, automation is one of those things that people are always striving for. But one of the the things that we talked about is that the environment changes. We talked about adaptable data. The same is true for your processes around automation. You have to continually look at the processes that are defining what that automation is and make sure they're still relevant in your organization. Because if you're taking automated action and it's no longer relevant to the types of threats your organization is seeing, it's more noise, right? It's not very useful at that point. So you do have to go back, circle back periodically, and look at what you've automated, how you've automated it, and are you getting the outcomes you expect from that automation? And if you're not doing that, you're 100% right. It's naive to think that it's going to be an answer, certainly for anything at that point, if you're not actually doing the right things.
So I want to dig a little bit deeper into your answer there. How do you make sure that you're getting access to data before it's been monetized or used against you even?
Well, that's again selecting the right vendors that are diving into that darknet data in the way that I described at those deeper levels. You need to be able to monitor and access information that criminals are actively trading and using for the more sophisticated, quieter attacks. I love things like the mother of all breaches that got announced, and everybody got very excited about that. It opens people's eyes to things that they may not be paying attention to. But the honest truth is, those types of information leaks out in the wild are less damaging than the quieter information that you're only going to get by partnering with a company that is looking at the underground in a very deep analytical way and analyzing what criminals are actively doing and how they're using the information so that that can be fed into analytics that are servicing you and your decisions around automation.
So speaking of which, I've heard that session hijacking has led to several recent high-profile breaches. How does that relate to credentials and how we should be looking at our automation plans?
Well, there's some interesting stuff there, right? Uh, Criminals no longer hack into networks, they log in. That's been true for quite a while now. They're using, user credentials, usernames, passwords, that sort of thing to just, that they're coming across through breaches, et cetera, malware infections, info stealing malware, taking credentials, and just logging in and moving laterally once they get in and doing all sorts of damage. This is, again, getting back to the adaptability piece. This has changed a little bit. It's access, right? Access is the identity piece here. It's not just user credentials. Access is provided through a lot of open doors, including cookies. Session hijacking is preeminent, and also API key usage when those get exposed. Cookies are really interesting, right? There have been several recent breaches that have occurred that were directly related to cookies. One major SSO provider had cookies that were exposed and gave stair-step access to admin accounts and customer admin accounts that wound up compromising multiple organizations. Scary stuff. Another story related to cookies as well was a CI/CD platform having cookies exposed by virtue of a browser sharing information. So Chrome and several other browsers have this capability where, regardless of where you're logged in, all of the information from your profile gets shared across multiple machines if you choose to do so. And that includes your cookies, credentials, all sorts of other information. And so if you're doing that sort of sharing from an enterprise machine to maybe a personal machine, or a machine that's less protected for whatever reason, and that machine gets popped with info stealing malware, all of those credentials are stolen. And if you're in the enterprise and you're monitoring that enterprise box, you're going to be none the wiser. And that's what happened to this organization is those cookies got compromised, and that led to follow-on attacks. The last big newsworthy case related to cookies that I'm aware of, and it's fairly recent as well, really underlines the fact that the criminals are using networks and sharing information fairly openly. And one of the big underground networks, for $10, criminal was able to buy session cookies for Slack, and got access to the communications platform, and then um, basically acted as a user and made an IT request that then got them deeper access into the organization. So those sorts of things, they happen. And those are the things that you need to really be aware of, is that it's not just credentials. You need to be looking at all the means of access to your organization, capturing that information, and then automating remediation to prevent that access from being leveraged.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think that is all we have time for. So let me just move this out of the way. If you want more, you can check out our web page. You can go to spycloud.com and our resources page. We have guides, we have reports such as our recently released identity exposure report and other helpful resources such as an actionable data checklist that we mentioned in this presentation. You can check out our blog and sign up for a monthly newsletter where we'll just round up all of our most important resources for you and we can send it right to your inbox. And you can also check to see if your organization has been exposed to any of that darknet data at spycloud.com/check your exposure. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, Taylor and Chip, and we'll see you next time.